Greetings and welcome back to another episode of the Daily Run, and today we're playing as Judas. This daily starts off with a pretty controversial decision. Of course, because every item you take costs you some points in this game, you really want to avoid some really pointless items. And Fart Baby is definitely one of those items, or at least one of those familiars, that kind of feels very pointless because it doesn't really do much. Try Baby is okay because not only does it block bullets, but it has a chance to kill every enemy in the room, while Fart Baby does kind of fall behind the curve just a little bit. It's still useful because it can still block bullets, and maybe its greatest feature if there's a bullet hell, so a lot of bullets at once. If it blocks one bullet, it can trigger, and when it triggers, it actually disperses all of the other bullets kind of away from you. And in this particular case, I decided to pick it up because I'm Judas and I only have one red health, which means I'm very likely to die if maybe a weird shot hits me, especially with monster or something like that, because you really can't see them. So having a way to protect myself, or maybe an additional layer of protection, even if it isn't that good, just seemed like a good idea to have. So for that reason, I decided to pick it up. My maybe thinking in that situation is, if this particular item saves me from hit even once, it's already worth it, because picking it up cost me something like 20 points, maybe 30 points, but actually getting hit cost me something like 300 points in total. So even if it can protect me once, it's probably a good idea to actually pick it up. In this particular case, I think it saved me even 3 or maybe even 4 times from just getting hit, so it all worked out in the end. And I really have to say that I like familiars, or just items in general, which allow you to block tears from actually hitting you. In this situation, even though Fart Baby doesn't have any other redeeming qualities other than just blocking shots, I do feel like it's still a pretty decent defensive option, especially in a character that's as volatile as Judas is. Another thing that we got on the first floor was the trinket, and was the golden horseshoe, I believe. And the golden horseshoe is a very, very tricky trinket to even understand. It doesn't really seemingly do anything, and that's always the worst when you have a trinket or maybe an item which just change maybe some stats or maybe percentages around, so you're never really sure either what those percentages are or even what the item or the trinket does. In this case, I believe the golden horseshoe increases the chances of you finding double treasure rooms, so the treasure rooms which have 2 items in them. So that can either be that there are 2 items in the treasure room, or that you can pick one or the other item which usually shows up. And I would say that obviously that's a good thing, but I think as a counterbalance, or maybe as a measure to prevent it from being too strong, even though I think it's quite weak, is that I think you also have an increased chance of finding double boss rooms. So double boss rooms are a new feature that was added in Afterbirth, so not really new at this point, but essentially when you enter a floor, on a particular floor, you can have 2 bosses in them. Those 2 bosses will always be from the previous set of stages, so if you're in the depths, for example, you're always... let's say if you're on the 3rd floor, you're always gonna get the bosses from the 1st and the 2nd floor. So you can fight something like 2 pins, maybe a pin and a monster and things like that. You'll never have to face like 2 bloats at once, except if you're maybe at the womb already. But all in all, it's a pretty rare occurrence. It doesn't really happen often. Sometimes it can be really, really scary to actually encounter it. But I think the golden horseshoe increases the chances of finding that. Well, my problem with that is, just in gist, I do understand that having a higher chance to find double treasure rooms is already a pretty powerful effect, because obviously you have 2 items to choose from instead of 1. But I did argue not too long ago that I think that finding 2 items in the treasure room as opposed to 1 isn't even that much better, because the item pool is so diluted. There's so many items that really don't do anything, so just being offered 2 at the same time instead of 1, I think even though it increases your chances of finding a good item, it's still not high enough to actually warrant such a maybe degrading boost. In this case, I decided to pick it up, even though I think it's a bad trinket, or at least in most cases it would end up being pretty bad, just because for the novelty of it, you don't really use it often. So I just decided maybe it'll bring me some interesting boss fights, and maybe I can show those off. I did drop it on the 3rd floor because my health situation was kind of wonky, and one thing that I really kind of defined this run was those first 3 floors. So depending, I think, on how your first 3 floors went, if you even survived, will really dictate the rest of your run. And in this case, I was kind of unlucky. I got the telepills, and I got teleported to the I Am Error room, and I believe the telepills teleportations aren't seeded, which means that only me and a few other people will actually go to that particular room, which means not only did we miss out on a potential good secret room, second secret room, in my case I think I even missed the boss, which means I also missed the devil deal. So if there was something good there, I'm essentially locked out of it, and this was definitely my mistake in some regard. You should never just blindly use pills, or at least in theory you should never blindly use pills, because something like that can happen. You should always wait until the end of the floor maybe, or unless maybe you're sure that there is a certain pill, or maybe that a certain pill isn't in the rotation, maybe you should wait until a more opportune moment to actually use them. And of course, like we do, we don't really ignore those minute differences, because using a pill now or maybe in 5 rooms is not really gonna make that much of a difference, just because of how rare it even is to get the I'm arrow room through the telepills. In this case, it did happen. I think this is the first time that it happened to me in like 80 runs. So it always sucks when it happens. I did get an item out of it, which wasn't really that good, and I believe I got Arrow Claw, which is okay, but it's obviously not very good. I think that some people said, or at least I read that on the Depths one, or maybe on the floor that I got teleported, at least I believe, was in the Secret Room there was a blank card and the Rune Bag, and obviously having to do those two items together will just allow you to eventually get a Arrow Rune, and then you can break the game with blank card and just really kind of spiral out of control from that point on. For me, this run was pretty on the weak side, and not necessarily because of damage, because with Judas you're never really struggling for damage. We did also get 3 or 4 damage items in general, but even from a utility standpoint, all of the items that we got were very opportune. They weren't really something that improves your run immediately. So for example, something like There's Options, it doesn't really help you unless you fight a boss room and actually complete it, and even in that case, it's an item that doesn't really do anything for you until you get a few bosses, and only then will it actually start showing value. And maybe for another example is Tarot Claw, and Tarot Claw is obviously a good item if you can have some cards to actually go along with it, but in this case, we really couldn't use it, so for that reason, Tarot Claw was just useless to us, so essentially it's like picking up an item that doesn't have any effect. That's not to say it can be useful later on, but I'm just saying that in terms of just how retroactive your items are and how much they do for you, they didn't really do much, or at least a lot of the items that I had didn't really do that much for me. Basically, the only thing I had for me was those 4 damage up items and the Shatter Bones. And Shatter Bones are great in their own regard, but I wouldn't call them maybe like the best tier effect. They're really not maybe that effective at disposing of enemies. They're okay. You can still kill enemies quite fast with them, especially if you have maybe a higher rate of fire. But in this case, because we didn't find any tears ups, we were stuck at base tier, and we really weren't shooting that fast, so it was kind of a slog just going through the rooms. And the fact the boss rush took 10 minutes is also probably pretty telling that something isn't quite right on this particular run. So at this point, I did pick up the shovel on the second floor, and that was a decision that I saw that some people didn't make, and I'm really interested in maybe the decision behind that one. My idea was, even though I had only 1 red heart and 1 spirit heart, obviously you don't really want to risk that 1 last red health, because you're just gonna die, especially on the Depths one. If you get a Dank Depths, there's so many room variations which have a ton of bad enemies which can just hit you, and it's not really gonna work out. But my idea behind picking up the shovel, even though it puts me in a very, very risky position, is that if I pick up the shovel, this is basically a surefire way to go 1 floor deeper, and if there is a sacrifice room on that particular floor on Shoal, that means I can go to the dark room, which means that people who have picked up the shovel will just be super ahead of me for going that route, of course, if they actually make it to the dark room. And if they make it to the dark room, then you can be the lamp, and you can imagine that score difference is just going to increase and increase. As opposed to not picking up the shovel in that situation, sure, you might have 1 more health, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the difference between you making it to the womb and not. And I definitely think it's one of those decisions that you make because maybe you're not too sure in the decision you're making, and you're basically playing not to be the best on the leaderboard, so you're not competing maybe for the top 10, but by not picking up the shovel, you at least hope that you beat the people who did pick up the shovel, but failed because they ended up dying at some point or another. And I think that's definitely a valid strategy, at least to some extent, and I like it when you have those micro decisions, depending on maybe how you want to rank up, or maybe you just want to increase your score as far as possible. And of course, picking up the shovel in that situation is more like a risk versus reward kind of thing, and I always like being kind of crazy. I decided to pick it up. Thankfully, it worked out for me. Even though I got teleported to the Devil Deal from the red chest, and the red chest actually contained Krampus, and fighting Krampus at 1 red health in Afterbirth Plus is usually a doom sentence, because he's impossible to actually fight sometimes. If he does any of his Brimstone attacks, you don't know which one he does, you don't know if he's gonna rotate, and what's even worse is when he stops actually shooting and rotating, he can still move with the Brimstone attacks, and often he leaves you in a position where you really can't dodge any of the damage. So for that reason, like I said, I understand people who didn't pick up the shovel, and actually in this particular case, people who didn't pick up the shovel actually got an angel room from that particular red chest, and they found the relic, and of course that is just gonna allow them to be okay, but of course they're not gonna have a way to actually get the shoal like I did in this case. Thankfully, I also found the relic, but very much later on. I found it in this particular sacrifice room. You can see that I'm taking a very big risk here. I only have 10 health, and you usually need at least 13 spirit hearts to actually play the sacrifice room and go on from there. To be kind of safe, not safe, but at least you want to have 11 spirit hearts. If you're feeling very lucky, you need to have at least 11 spirit hearts to actually do it, because you can see at this point I did sacrifice and I was only a 1 spirit heart remaining when I actually got a payout of 7 more spirit hearts. And of course, when that happens, that's a 50% chance of happening. If you're feeling kind of lucky, in this case I did, I decided to risk it just a little bit. I took the spirit hearts and actually did manage to get the dark robe, and that was a very ballsy play in some regards, but also maybe more of a calculated play. Again, this is one of those things. If there is a person who was in the same situation as I was, and they were trying to go for the sacrifice room, and they did get a payout, like in this case I did, and probably everyone else who played it also did get a payout spirit hearts, that means that they were teleported to the dark room, and they're just gonna be ahead of me no matter what I do. But in this case, if I do the same thing again, sure, I'm taking a risk, but I'm trying to get as high as possible, which means that I don't want to be left behind. So I think it's a good idea to actually take the risk yourself, even because that risk is not maybe that high. It's a 50% chance risk. I would even say maybe a bit less, because there's still a chance to get spirit hearts via other means, maybe on the previous sacrifice room play, or maybe from the angel room, or maybe from a chest, which then gives you spirit hearts. So maybe it's a bit less, so it's not exactly as risky as I maybe make it sound to be, but it's still a decision that was maybe a bit on the ballsy side. I did get the relic in the sacrifice room, like I pointed out earlier, but for some reason it didn't pay out on the dark room. I don't know what that is. I believe that the relic is supposed to pay out with a spirit heart at least every 4 rooms, unless that was changed. But even though I was beating these bosses and just kind of going along, I faced some adversary rooms which aren't very nice. And even though I just didn't get any spirit hearts out of it. And that was quite weird. I really thought that the relic was gonna be my saving grace when I actually picked it up. It turned out that it wasn't, and it was just a very unfortunate situation, because I was debating whether I should maybe fight the boss or not with 2 spirit hearts, but I got hit on the last room, and as soon as I entered that room with 2 Gurdis, they just instantly rushed me. I didn't really even have the time to dodge because I was quite slow, and I was just left in a position where I really couldn't do anything. I ended up dying, but overall I still feel like my score is pretty decent. I'm definitely the top 100s, at least at this point, so that's okay in some regard, but obviously it could have been a little bit better. I think if you beat the lamp in this particular case, we would rank much higher, but hey, what can you do? I'm still glad that we actually managed to get in the top 100. I hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and I hope to see you next time.